Now I have a rather important little shell here. It's available around many parts of the planet, but it was first found living in the Mediterranean. And it's one of the shells that plays a big role in our scientific classification scheme. Now, you may have heard of the name Linnaeus or Carl von Linné. You may have heard of names Steno and others like that, and the names will crop up several times in this section, particularly if you're interested in dealing with the claim that fossils prove evolution. Now, the reason I came across this one is A, it's found locally in Moreton Bay, just 10 kilometers behind me here. But B, its name was given to it by Linnaeus, and it was found in the Mediterranean, and it was called the Arca shell, Arka. Now, if you have a look close up, you'll see it's like the medieval picture of Noah's Ark, and it's got a little cabin on the top, and there's no doubt about it. Linnaeus and Steno and all the others had a firmly biblical view. And their biblical view included a couple of things. A, animals, plants, shells, etc. were created by God to produce their own kind. Now, if you don't have that philosophy, you can't classify anything. Why? Because this would have been a different species, maybe even 10 years ago, and it will be on its way to another species. Now, the sheer fact of classification is based on the belief that there are identical, there are finite, there are distinct groups that you can give labels to. That's why the Greeks failed in their attempts to come up with a classification system. It's why the evolutionists are actually destroying the classification system now to the point of impossibility. Because if evolution is true, classification is an absolutely fluid and meaningless thing to have. But Linnaeus, Arca shell, after Noah's Ark, and I mean, you can find these in the Jurassic. And if you want to know how you recognize a fossil Arca shell, they look like dead Arca shells. It's as simple as that, even if they've been here for hundreds of millions of years. Now, I remember learning about Arca shells when I was at Queensland University as a geology student, and the professor, he said, well, if you want to see these living fossils, then go down to Shorncliffe. Now, Shorncliffe's a good example here in Queensland where there's a sharp cliff. It's been shorn off, and the English people have taken this name all over the planet. You can find Shorncliffes in England. You can find Shorncliffes in the USA. Anywhere the cliff has been shorn off. Shorncliffe near Sandgate here in Queensland. And he said you'll find that living fossils, the Arca shells, wash in with the tides and get caught in the rocks of the creek bed there. So I went down and I've collected hundreds of them. No, not the fossil ones, the remains of the living Arca shells, living fossils. No help to evolution. But down at that place there, it's famous for several things. One is you look at the creek and the place you find these shells is trapped behind big boulders with layers of quartz in and with metamorphic rocks in, trapped in a sedimentary rock. And you do a bit of field tripping around Queensland and you say, I've seen these rocks before. And you can actually spot them up in the mountains 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers behind the creek mouth. There's no doubt about it. Provably, they've originated up in the metamorphic rocks at the top of places like Mount Cootha and like that. They've been washed down and they are humongous. It must have been catastrophic. You've had an earthquake too because there's a big fault running down the edge there, and there's fossils. Fossils? No, not the living fossils. I mean, you dig up the rocks. We used to be able to. It's an off-limit site now unless you get a special permit from the local council. So please don't go down there and start smashing the rocks in the cliff. You might get arrested. You can pick up the rocks on the beach because if they wear off, the logic is if it's going to wear out and bust up, you may as well collect it. And you'll find all sorts of fossil plants and a few layers of fossil shells too. But what's famous is it used to be a geological location for the Jurassic. That sign's gone now because those rocks are classified as Triassic. Jurassic, as Joe said, in the Jura Mountains. Triassic, tri meaning three colours, named from a location in Germany where the rocks were reddish, whitish, and yellowish brownish. Triassic, three colours. And that's what they're like down there, except it used to be based on a different category. Now, you say, so what? The geologists are updating their information. No, they've just changed the age of the rocks by quite a considerable amount to go from the Jurassic up to the Triassic. So if you think the geology column stays constant, forget it. It depends on the latest theory. It depends on the latest opinion. I have to sadly remember a thesis I did at UQ in which I had to find a fossil all by myself, and then I had to do a paper on it and submit it. Well, I found a fossil called Bodantisaurus flinders. Now, I was only the second person in Queensland's, Australia's history to find one of those. The first one had been found down a well hole. So I did my paper and submitted it, and I failed. Yep, even John Mackay could fail things. And when I inquired as to why I'd failed, the tutor said, well, you didn't catch up to the latest paper on the reclassification of this fossil into a different zone. I said, well, how am I supposed to know about the latest PhD on this? I said, it's not even publicly available. He said, well, that's your problem. And I thought, man, that is not really fair. These academics who go to the top of the pile and no one else can see that far yet. Oh, but then I got my own revenge back. Last time I went to the museum, here is my Bodantisaurus flinders reclassified back to Bodantisaurus flinders. I won in the end. It just took a lot of patience and got no credit. You realize how these things do change? You realize that this knowledge is, if you're an evolutionist, then it doesn't matter to you what the information is. The Bible says, speak to the earth and it will teach you God's hand has done this thing. And this is a God who doesn't change. So don't be surprised. You can be accurate about fossils. You can be accurate about the layers. You can be accurate about whether animals and plants, like the ones I showed you, actually do change. Okay, you'll see a memo about our newsletter. You heard about that. But in 3 weeks' time, or a bit under 3 weeks' time, on the 20th of May and the 21st, we have another seminar on the origin of Australian Aborigines at Margate Baptist Church. That's not far away from where I am at the moment, about 20-30 minutes. So that's 20th and 21st of May on the origin of the Aborigines, Saturday and Sunday. Join us at Margate Baptist Church. Now, there's where Craig took you. Fossil record shows that organisms appeared in a historical sequence. I'm not going to repeat what Craig said, but you need to know that that is a picture of real history in people's heads. So when they go to the Grand Canyon, they see millions of years, despite the fact they haven't got a clue how long it would take those rocks to be laid down. They see evolution, despite the fact that most of them have never ever found a fossil. And of course, you get specific cases of where the fossils are arranged. Did you catch that word? Arranged to make a family tree. So that in the history of whales, the story is at the moment, whales used to be land creatures. Then they went into the sea. And of course, some of them came back out and turned into land creatures as well. Rather interesting stories, all based on fossils. So what we're going to do is begin to pick apart the geologic column so you can see how accurate this might not be. Here's the program we tackled the other week for Standing for Truth. And again, I'd encourage you, catch up with their channel, catch up with Joe and I on it particularly. A background to time. What are we looking at? The brand new opening display at the Geological Museum in the middle of London there. Fantastic display. What have they got? A whole keyboard there on all sorts of things that provide background, looking for miracles. The myth of a global flood began over 5,000 years ago. Perhaps there's a story to explain the presence of fossil seashells on mountain sites around Mediterranean. It's led to centuries of debate centered around the biblical story of Noah and the flood. Now, it's interesting, they've got the date 5,000 years, which surprisingly is not far from a biblical picture of 4,500 to 5,000 years. But why do they call it a myth? It tells you that In geology, the one thing you're not allowed to believe is a fact about Noah's flood. You can believe it as a myth, as a religious superstition, if you like, but it can't be regarded as real history. And then they tell you the present unlocks the past. This is a signboard there. By 1830, through the work of Scottish geologists James Hutton and Charles Lyell, both Scotsmen, by the way, it was clear that the Earth is very old. Furthermore, given this unlimited allowance of time. Now, I find that an interesting statement because I wonder how it would be clear that the world is very old, particularly to a man who's not 50 or not even 30. How would you know whether something was old or not? It reminds me of the old joke about aliens coming to Earth and wondering whether we're old getting younger or young getting older, or whether we're just static. You see, age is not something you can see. Age is something you have to experience. What's not mentioned in any of this? Here. This is not a new debate. It started ages ago. Theophilus of Antioch wrote that creation occurred 5529 BC plus or minus 200. Now, I'll be honest, he didn't use plus or minus 200 because no one invented that sort of system at those days. But that's the essence of what he was saying. Theophilus, God lover, a Christian bishop. Creation occurred, not the tens of thousands, as Plato, etc., has written. Do you realize Plato was a pagan? Do you realize Plato may be renowned for his wisdom, but he was a pagan and all his answers had to fit in that system? Theophilus was a Christian. He accepted the biblical worldview of history, and Plato accepted the non-biblical world. And the debate centers around the age of the earth back then as it does now. Okay, the town of Durham in England has even got a signboard on their website boasting as to one of their bishops invented the term geology. The word was invented to distinguish study of heavenly things from the study of earthly things. Oh, you need to know, by the way, that GEO is derived from GIA, which is the old goddess of the earth. So as much as the Bishop of Durham wanted to have a biblical view of geology, he actually used words that were embedded in a pagan view of things. But notice he's back in the 1300s. No concept of evolution in England in those days. There was lots of coal around Durham, but no concept of vast swamps over vast amounts of time at all. By the time you get up to Portugal, and the church is still embedded in the whole of society, the Catholic Church has a date that the world is 6685. What? AD 1485? Oh, yes. You see, we know those two dates were equivalent because the Portuguese sailed around the planet and they posted it up. Cape Cross was named in the year 6685 after the time of creation. Okay, so even if you think it was plus or minus 400 or 500 from that, what you're realizing is the general mindset of the average European in England or in Europe was a biblical one, which was, well, what the evolutionists call young earth. And it doesn't change by the time you get through the Reformation. Martin Luther, 6 days, approximately 6,000 years ago. John Calvin, 6 days, approximately 6,000 years ago. Archbishop Usher, approximately 6,000 years ago. Now, do you realize these guys, you might think of them as scientifically ignorant. They aren't really. Luther wrote papers on why evolution is wrong. Calvin and these other guys were actually renowned in their legal sense, and Archbishop Usher, well, I've got to be honest, he traveled all over Europe digging up stuff on how long the world had been here in terms of the different groups of people. These are quite credible academics in their own way. By the time you get to the founding father of geology, Nicholas Steno, yes, he became a bishop and an impoverished one later in his life. He was a follower of Luther to start with, so he had a biblical view, but he imposed on that a principle of superposition. What's that? That's where you believe the bottom layer got there before the top layer, and the bottom layer got there before the layer above it. Now, he certainly believed in 6 days of creation, and he believed in worldwide flood. He got that out of the Bible. But his principle of superposition, I hate to tell you this, he didn't get it out of the Bible. He didn't get it by running experiments. He got it by thinking about the rocks and assuming that the bottom layer had got there first. There's his logic. The bottom layer formed first, and the strata above were laid down horizontally. Now, what he should have done was set up a strata machine like we have to see if that's how it works or not. But he didn't. And much of the rest of the geologists have assumed that to be true from that day to this. And you see it in the classrooms. Remember the experiment I've told you about? You get a test tube, you fill it full of water, then sand and mud and pebbles, and shake it up and watch the bottom layer fall down first. And then the finer sediments, then the finer sediments again. And you tell the kids that's how the rock layers form? Yeah, well, it might be if the world was a glass of water, but it isn't. In the real world, water is flowing sideways. But John Ray, yes, famous for his work with botany as well. He was one of the advisors to Linnaeus on the classification system, and Hooke, Hooke's principle with springs and stuff. They both said, if Steno is correct, the world is too old for the Bible to be true. Now, that's what you call valid criticism. Now, can I be honest with you out there? That's what Joe and I and creation research is saying to many of the other creationists. If you want to stick with Steno's principle of superposition, you will end up with a view that's impossible to reconcile with a biblical flood where the water is flowing sideways. Now, we mightn't have all the details worked out as how you get from one to the other, but Ray and Hooke make a truly valid point. By the time you get to France, how would you like a name like that? George Louis Leclerc de Buffon. He calculated Adam and Eve came into being 6,000 to 8,000 years before present. I've said it before and I'll say it again, because France was Catholic. He couldn't say anything else. You see, they needed Adam. They needed Adam to be a sinner, or the priests were out of business, and they couldn't take up money for funerals to get you into purgatory. This was vital doctrine, couldn't be lost. So the dates of the first man are not far from the biblical one, but the earth, he claimed, had been in existence for 75,000 years. Now, in case you think he was a bit of an aberration, no, he becomes an important person. And in fact, when you look at that book listed there from the Paleontological Institute of Paris, no one before de Buffon had mentioned figures of this magnitude. Now, I don't know about you, but I've dealt with some French people, and I do have to say that the French have themselves in very high estimation, because you only have to do a bit of history to discover that the Chaldeans had bigger figures than Buffon is. But in French Europe, they didn't see outside of their own history back through the Romans or whatever. They didn't see that. Buffon felt Noah's flood made little impact. Earth's geological features had come from normal, everyday effects of wind and weather. Then he wrote a book in 1771, not on God's dealing with the word, not on the book of Job that says, speak to the earth, it'll teach you God did this thing. He wrote a book leaving God out deliberately, because he was going to be one of the big influences in science, the epics of nature, otherwise today known as Charles Lyell's principle of uniformitarianism. He suggested 7 epochs of history, and only in the last one was man added to nature. Added? Yes, sort of a strange view of creation, but he needed man to fund the Catholic Church, or else his work would have got nowhere. It took until the time of basically the revolution in France before you could dare criticize the Catholic Church. In Scotland, you get the Scots influenced by the French. Yes, being a Scotsman background myself, if the French say it, the Scots will accept it, the English will reject it. If the English say it, the Scots will reject it. Have a look at our history. It's marvellous in looking at those. Now, Hutton, he took up what Steno had taken. He took up what the French had said. Present-day slope bases explain everything. Therefore, the world is old, and you can see why he was criticized as an atheist, because he said there's no sign of beginning. He got rid of creation. Make the world old? there's no sign of creation. Now, I've been to all these places deliberately. Yes, thank you for those of your support, and we'd encourage you to continue to send finances. This costs a lot of money to do. There's the original drawing of Huttons on what the rocks are like at Jedburgh. Notice how cleared the land is. Notice the top layers are horizontal and the bottom layers are vertical. Now, I've been there. There it is today. If you think the world is being deforested, get real. In case you missed it, look, that's what it was in Hutton's time. There it is today. There's exactly the same location. There's the conglomerate on the top. There's the metamorphic rocks down the bottom. There's the Devonian, and there's the Silurian. Devonian, because those rocks are named after Devon. Silurian, because you find the same sort of rocks over where the Siluri people in Wales. Again, location, 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 not age. But once you've made the location equal in age, then here's what happens. You see, Devonian sits on top of Silurian, but 20 million years are missing. 1,000 million years are missing on the unconformity around the globe, 20 million years missing on this so-called local unconformity. Then you get Hutton and Lyell tying together. Lyell builds on Hutton, and the present is the key to the past. Why didn't Hutton get famous for this? Because he spoke his own version of Scots English, and the English didn't understand him. Lyell was a trained lawyer who worked in England, and his English was much better with very minimal Scots. Much better writer. Look what he said. Uniformitarianism, the old earth, bottom layer formed first. The rock layers are now not just rock layers, they are a record, a book of life. And they differ. You can get their name by working out what percentage of fossils are in them. So we've gone from having rocks that are described by Steno to rocks that were laid down the bottom one first and then the next one, to rocks that were laid down with the bottom one, animals living and dying, then the next layer, then the next layer. Then they are a record of life on Earth. Now Lyell comes along and says, just use the fossils to classify them. And there's Lyell's most famous disciple, his most famous willingly brainwashed disciple. Notice what Darwin said. I always feel as if my books came half out of Lyell's brain, and I never acknowledge this sufficiently. What did he do as he traveled around on the Beagle? He actually read Lyell over and over again. And later on in 1844, in a letter to Mr. Horner, he admits this. There's the result. So Steno, biblical view, Steno, young earth, Steno, Noah's flood, Steno, one wrong step. The bottom layer got there first. Ray and the others warned him, if you believe that, the world is too old for the Bible to be true. Now we're several hundred years later, and we are thousands of millions of years, and we're not using the fossils to classify the rocks just for their age. We're using the change in content to prove a theory of evolution and throwing Steno's Bible out totally. There's what Darwin has said. The percentage difference in fossil strata content due to life forms in lower layers evolving into ones over millions of years reject Genesis. Now, we have a big issue with child discipline, with student misbehavior, with youth criminals in Queensland at the moment. I'll give you one big clue. Teach them evolution, they behave like animals because that's all they are. Teach them they got here by chance and they can't see any reason for living past tomorrow because there's nothing there. There's nothing coming. There's no judgment. You get caught, you go to jail, they let you out. Pathetic. There's a key influence. The theory of evolution has produced people who behave like animals. Hitler was one of them, and now the young people in Queensland are another. But look, the fossil revolution again, the book on how the fossils that changed our world. Darwin was worried because if the theory of evolution is true, it's indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian layer was deposited, long periods had elapsed, and during this vast periods, the world swarmed with living creatures. Did you catch that? For Darwin, if you come up with this theory, then you have to have vast amounts of time. Why? Because in this world, all the changes we see are downhill. So you must have long enough for some uphill ones to change. So by the latter part of the 19th century, says the author of this book, Charles Lyell and Darwin were using rates of erosion and deposition to have an Earth hundreds of millions of years old. Well, that's when I first did this program. By AD 2006, the world is estimated to be approximately 4.6 billion years old. Now, I gave that lecture, and an old gentleman came up to me and he said, if you want to test this, he said, just grab your university textbooks and go through them. I said, yeah, what'll I find? He said, you'll find that about every 20 years, the age of the Earth doubles, beginning with Steno. Now, if you want a good challenge, go and find that yourself. Because whether it's the Triassic coming from the Jurassic overnight by definition, or whether it's the rocks in Canada getting older and older and older, or the very rocks my house is built on, changing from Precambrian all the way up to Ordovician, Silurian. With a little bit of Triassic floating around on the top there, up at the corner where I can dig up mud fossils from the Ipswich coal beds. You'll find that age is not a fact. Age is a fiction imposed upon the layers. And it got there because of Steno making one serious error. And I'd encourage all of you creations out there who are trying to deal with this, start there and repack. Don't start there and rebuild with a creation view on top. You will catch yourself out in exactly the same way. All right, again, a reminder, then we'll throw it open to questions. It's 7:20 here. Again, a reminder, if you want to have a look at our whole seminar, Saturday and Sunday, 20th, 21st of May, it's on again here in Southeast Queensland at Margate Baptist Church, just on the north side, not far away from that Sean Cliff. You can go down there and collect some fossils for yourself. A wonderful combined day. So.